our speaker series, and could not think of a better person to have here for our final installment of this. Really excited to finally have Emily Ramshaw come to campus. She has been a part of the Texas Tribune since day one, which is, now y'all are probably the leading nonpartisan, nonprofit digital news organization in the country, if not the world. Like I said, she's been there since day one. And just last week was announced that she is now the editor-in-chief of the Tribune. So congratulations. We've had several members from the Tribune here over the past couple years, and last semester when the Tribune CEO, Evan Smith, was here, he called Emily the most important woman in digital news. And that's really cool to end the semester on a high note with some nice diverse speakers. So let's please welcome Emily Ramshaw. She'll be interviewed by graduate student Becky Larson.
Also, just to be clear, Evan Smith is full of it. So if any of you were here for that conversation.
Yep. Thank you so much for being here. Can you guys, yeah, sounds good. All right. So in the piece that Evan wrote when he named you the editor-in-chief, he said something that I thought was really interesting. He said that this isn't the beginning of the end, with him stepping out of that position, but he called it the end of the beginning for the Texas Tribune. So do you agree with that statement? And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, what it means to me is that we've been in super startup mode since day one. So the last 6 years, basically, even though we felt like we were competing in the digital space, we still felt like 21-year-olds in our first tech startup. It was really sort of running and gunning. We were at high speed, high velocity, nonstop. And I think we're at a point, the Tribune's at a point where we feel like we have sort of come into our own, and we are not chasing our tails anymore. But at the same time, we have a really critical challenge ahead of us, and that's figuring out what happens when the Tribune is no longer the shiny new object in this digital space. How do we sort of grow into really one of the leading nonprofit news organizations in the country? And so I think that presents a pretty big challenge for us. And I think, Evan was ready to say, I'm ready to be the CEO full time, and I'm ready for our journalism vision to sort of rest firmly with the newsroom that we've established.
So how do you maintain kind of that nimble startup, like all of the things that make startup culture really important and innovative and experimental? You want to be able to fail fast and move forward. How do you maintain that, or can you?
I think size and culture is important. I mean, I've worked in other newsrooms, and I think it's really easy to be nimble when you're at an organization that is relatively limited in size, relatively limited in scope, and to be blunt, young. I mean, we have a very vibrant news operation. I'd say the average age in our newsroom is probably 28 or 29. We have a lot of young developers. We have a lot of really talented fellows who are coming to us from universities, including Texas State. It's easy to stay nimble and to be creative when you have a lot of sort of new blood flowing through your organization. So we take that really seriously. We also don't have layers and layers of bureaucracy. We're an organization where, again, a fellow coming in the door can suggest an idea for a new platform that we should be on, or, a new news apps developer can say, well, have we considered presenting stories or telling stories in this particular way? And we're able to sort of act fast and try it out. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it falls flat. It's not scary to us to try things and have them not work. And I think that's a lot scarier for sort of bigger institutional news organizations with many, many layers of sort of bureaucracy and seniority.
So it sounds like to some extent that the ability that you have to maintain that nimble sort of attitude is a function of the team that you have working with you. Is there anything that you are hoping to kind of hardwire into strategy for that?
It's interesting. I mean, I think, again, you said the term fail fast, and I do think that's something for us. I think as we grow, we have to fight the urge to sort of slow down or to rest on our laurels. I think we have to really be, the only certainty in our industry right now, and for any of you entering this field, the only certainty is change. The industry that we're in right now is not anything like what the industry is going to look like in 5 years or in 10 years. And I think we all have to really get comfortable with that. If you are entering a news organization and you are not, and you're afraid of totally reinventing what you do every several years, I think you're in the wrong industry. So it's a culture of change, and I think making sure you have an organization and people around you who aren't afraid of that.
So you mentioned that part of Evan kind of moving, just being the CEO. And
Just,
sort of,
yeah, right. He said the words just being CEO. I don't think any of us would agree that being CEO is a just, but yeah.
for sure. So is separating that kind of business side of it and the newsroom, is that part of what you see as your strategy for success in the future, or is that important?
You know, I actually think it's the inverse of that. I think as journalists, we are getting a lot more comfortable with no longer using the term business side of the operation. I think, you know, nimble news organizations that are really forward-looking, I think you're going to start seeing a lot more collaboration and integration between the different sort of, you know, sides of the operation. You know, we think really creatively. We talk to our development director about, you know, the types of projects we want to pursue, so that development director can say, you know what, I actually might have a funder who's particularly interested in this topic. Or, you know, we work with our corporate sponsorship director to get, you know, certain kinds of ads on the Tribcast, our podcast. We have started crowdfunding, which is, you know, journalists in our news organization saying, boy, there's really a killer project I want to pursue. And I say, well, we don't really have that travel budget, you know, for that particular project this year. Why don't we think about using Kickstarter or Beacon, which some of you may be familiar with, another journalism crowdfunding tool. So if anything, we're breaking down those barriers, and not in a way that I think presents any ethical challenges. I mean, we are super, super cautious. You know, we make sure that no funding is driving the journalism to any degree. But I think we're in a day and age where everybody has to be creative about how we're going to continue to fund this industry. And I think one of the big challenges for many years was that journalists either didn't know or weren't invested in how their news organizations were making revenue. And so I really think that breaking down a lot of those walls is important for the future of our field.
Awesome. You led right into my next area that I wanted to ask about, which was niche revenue streams. So how important is it to diversify, you know?
So I think a lot of people who've looked at the Texas Tribune's business model would say that we have been particularly successful because our revenue streams are really diverse. You know, for us, we have basically 5 buckets of revenue, and I'm hoping that I don't pull a Rick Perry moment here. I'm going to try to name all 5 of them. We have corporate underwriting, which for all intents and purposes looks like advertising on our website. We have major donors, which for all intents and purposes are very wealthy individuals who believe in the mission of the Tribune, nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism. We have membership, which is more or less viewers like you. We are hoping that people love our content and want to sort of buy into it. We have events, which is really, you know, the Tribune's calling card, has become the Tribune's calling card, where we make, you know, in many cases more than $1 million a year off of certain types of public policy events. And then the 5th is foundation support. So, you know, the Knight Foundation, other philanthropic organizations that support the work that the Tribune is doing. And so for us, it's almost become like, you know, a fifth, all the way across those areas. If you look at a lot of other nonprofit news organizations, they're focused on, especially the small ones, you know, 1 or 2 major donors, 1 or 2 major foundations. That makes us nervous. You know, when we look at how oil prices in Texas are changing, you know, or how foundations, you know, move from one project to the next. We don't want to be dependent on any single revenue stream, and more importantly, we want to focus on earned revenue, which is the corporate underwriting, the events, providing value and having people pay for it. You know, because that seems like the most sort of sustainable strategy for making sure you can provide this kind of journalism in the long run.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically about your events? Because that's something that I think the Tribune really stands out for.
Yes, this was the genius Evan Smith strategy from the very beginning. I think, you know, he saw things like the New Yorker Festival or the Aspen Ideas Festival and thought, you know, geez, wouldn't it be awesome if we had something like that for Texas? He had this vision of this big 3-day politics and policy festival, which has really just been enormously successful. We had tickets go on sale today. This confirmed list of speakers already is like mind-blowing, becomes more and more national figures every year. But beyond the festival, we have more than 50 or 60 live events a year. Most of them are free to the public to attend. Many of them are in Austin, but there are now dozens and dozens across the far reaches of the state. We had one in Marfa last week. You know, and these events are often sponsored by corporate underwriters, which is how revenue comes in, and we can offer them free to the public. But they're also just an incredible opportunity for people to be face-to-face with their elected officials, to ask questions one-on-one. You know, there are not very many circumstances where you, as an average citizen, would get to ask Dan Patrick a question face-to-face. And so they've been incredibly valuable. We treat them as journalism. We live stream them. Thousands of additional people beyond those in the audience tune in to watch these events. It was interesting to me because, you know, I assumed people just sort of wanted to engage online in the digital age. And the reality is people still love to be, you know, in the front row, sticking their hand up in the air in person too. So that's been really a neat thing. I mean, kind of like we're doing right now. So.
You said that obviously there are barriers between your funding and your reporting. What kind of barriers? Like how is that kind of built in?
So funders play no role in the journalism that we produce. So, you know, all of the journalistic ideas, all the projects we pursue, they bubble up from the reporter level. You know, and reporters really have no interaction with our donors. You know, probably the closest thing we would get is a journalist, you know, shooting a little pitch video for one of our crowdfunding projects to say, you know, like, this is the project we want to pursue, and we need revenue in order to go down to the border and to spend 2 weeks in Central America, you know, following immigrant children or whatever. We are really, really cautious about disclosure. The Texas Tribune, I would say, goes above and beyond what any other nonprofit news organization does as far as disclosure is concerned. We put every dollar anybody gives us online in a searchable format, you know, down to the penny in some cases, whether it was an in-kind donation, whether it was for events, you know. And our editors, this is incredibly arduous, but we do it because we think it's important. Every story a reporter files to us, the editors go through the story afterward with a fine-tooth comb before it's published and say, okay, look for any name of a person who is a donor, look for any name of a company that might be a corporate underwriter, you know, and then we document at the bottom of every story before we publish it. So we take disclosure really, really seriously, and we think it's the best sort of ethical safeguard against any suggestions that, you know, we're taking money to tell a particular story.
Have you guys had that criticism, or has anybody leveled claims like that?
A couple of years ago, there was a blogger who, you know, who leveled some claims around those lines, and you know, at the time we had some disclosure, but not nearly the robust level that we have right now. So I think it was an opportunity. I think at first we sort of took it personally and said, you know, how dare you, you know, accuse us of this? Our journalists are so upstanding, and they're producing all this work out of the goodness of their hearts. You know, they don't even know who our donors are. And then we decided, you know, let's take this criticism as an opportunity to be the most transparent news organization out there. And, you know, truly, we were with a whole group of nonprofit news organizations who were in town for ISOJ. And almost all of them, without fail, have said, you know, the Tribune is really now the model for disclosure. I mean, beyond NPR, beyond PBS, you know, we are so detailed that it's become sort of a standard. So I'm proud of it. It was a hard time when we went through it, you know, thinking about how transparent we wanted to be, but I'm incredibly proud of it now.
So I, you know, in kind of preparing for this, I was looking through your tweets and everything, and
That's dangerous.
But so the Pulitzers, you know, were just recently announced, and I saw that you had retweeted something about 12 out of 14 of the Pulitzers were all East Coast news outlets or news organizations. Do you see a bias towards those outlets, or is that just where the good journalism is?
It's where media is concentrated right now. And to me, that was more of a statement on, you know, so much media is concentrated on the East Coast, and in particular in New York. I mean, you just look at the sort of clusters of where great journalism is being produced. And I do believe there are incredible journalists all over the country, but it is amazing to me to see this sort of centralization of news. And I think that's dangerous, to be honest. I mean, there are incredible stories scattered throughout so much of this country, you know, great journalism to be produced in New Orleans and clearly in Texas and in Chicago and St. Louis and in Ferguson, you know, and I do worry a little bit that as this business contracts and becomes so specialized that you're going to see everybody, you know, really in one location, and that's New York. As far as the Pulitzers are concerned, you know, I would say incredible nonprofit news organizations are winning Pulitzers, and collaboration has become so huge. You saw, you know, a big win between the brand new Marshall Project and ProPublica that was thrilling for those of us who, you know, who really love and admire those guys. I think, you know, I'd like to see, I think the Tribune is moving far more in an investigative and accountability direction than we did in the first couple of years that we existed. When we first got off the ground, I would say we were far more like a Politico for Texas than a ProPublica for Texas. And we have been shifting resources and hiring in a way that we hope that we can provide, really big picture accountability journalism. And we're partnering with other news organizations to do it. This year we had a huge project we just launched right before South by with ProPublica that was a look at the Houston Ship Channel, a big major mapping interactive that showed how devastated Houston would be by a hurricane, just a basic hurricane hitting the Houston Ship Channel. I mean, it's stunning to me, and it's pretty similar in a lot of ways to the New Yorker piece that won a Pulitzer about, fault lines on the West Coast. I mean, there are huge risks, and so we're trying to present more deep dive investigative journalism. But that kind of journalism is expensive, it's time consuming, and I think it presents a unique challenge for the Tribune, which is so dependent on sort of the daily news cycle. It's hard to step back with a staff of our size and say, you know what, reporter X, you take months to produce a big project like this. So that's an interesting challenge for us.
And that was Hell or High Water, right? That was the name of that project.
Exactly, Helen. Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So, what are the problems? Like, so you said that it's dangerous, it's problematic, for this centralization. I mean, is there anything kind of specific that you see, the problems that we run into when journalists from this one very tiny area are tasked with covering areas they may not live in, have experience in?
I mean, I think you see a lot of generalizations. Any of you who are from Texas have probably read stories, from national media outlets that make so many, sort of stereotypical assumptions about Texas. They're like, how many stories are we going to read where there are cowboy boots in the lead? And oh my God, like, I mean, much of Texas is totally cosmopolitan and urban now. And so many stories are written through this lens of sort of, backward Texas. So I think, there are challenges like that, but also I think for accountability in journalism, state house coverage in this country has really just shrunk dramatically. I mean, the Texas Tribune, we're only 6 years old, and we have the largest state house bureau of any news organization in the United States, and that includes the New York Times in Albany, that includes the LA Times, in California. I mean, there is a huge void, and so I think again the centralization, in particular, when it comes to sort of covering local politics and state house politics, I think you're seeing a real void around much of this country.
You would say that regional and local news is still really where it's at, or that's the heart?
I do think you're seeing a market improvement in certain regional markets, and that's exciting. I think, the new editor of the Dallas Morning News, Mike Wilson, I think really is a visionary and is trying to do a lot of really creative digital work there, making their news apps team far more robust, building up their staffing in certain areas. I think you've seen, the Houston Chronicle staff up its State House Bureau in Austin. There are a lot of really positive things happening in regional journalism, but I think often it's the exception, not the rule. So.
What you spent most of your time at South by talking about was social media. And I thought that was a really excellent talk. And I wanted to kind of get your take. Do you remember what you said your voice on Twitter is?
Oh God, I can't remember. I know I said something that ended up getting tweeted like crazy, and I was like, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Yeah.
You thought it was breaking news and calling bull.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But you talked about the fact that you really have to earn your credibility and reputation before you can have something like that, have that kind of voice. Yep. So what do you recommend for building that kind of credibility on social media? How do you?
I mean, I think a lot of it, frankly, is about your experience. I spent the first 7 years of my journalism career covering social services, investigating, state agencies, in particular agencies that provided care for, the elderly, the disabled, prisoners. I became, a mini expert on those topics. And so at this point, when I hear a state agency head, say something that I know to be patently false, I have no problem saying on Twitter, this is patently false. Or or being aggressive on a particular topic. I don't feel that comfortable with my brand new baby reporters who've only been on the beat for 2 months. We've had reporters in the past who I think their voice has been a little bit too either partisan or too sort of inflammatory, and we've reined them in. There have been fellow candidates who we actually have not hired. Or job candidates who we have turned away because of their social media profile in the past. So, it's a balance, and I hate to say it when you see it, but I think you sort of earn the right to have a particularly strong and authoritative voice on social media when you really know what the hell you're talking about.
when you are kind of trying to earn your street cred there and just build it up, how do you go about that? Are you just tweeting constantly all the time? Is that best practice?
I think, you have to be smart about it. There are people who tweet around the clock and have a huge following. I mean, man, our political reporter Patrick Svitek is like a machine. And that guy, he follows Ted Cruz, and he'll sometimes tweet things about Ted Cruz at like 2 in the morning, and I'll wake up in the morning and it'll have like 600 retweets or something. I mean, there are people. He has an incredibly, and he has an authoritative voice. He's playing it straight. He's not, there's no snark, very little, occasional snark. Mostly when he's tweeting in the middle of the night about hip hop, which is like his other favorite pastime other than Ted Cruz. So I think it depends on your followers. It depends on we've had reporters who cover women's health, and oh my goodness, if you cover women's health, you will go from having 1,000 Twitter followers to 12,000 Twitter followers almost overnight. And she has a strong voice. But again, I think you sort of earn the right over time. It doesn't matter how much or how little you tweet. It sort of hooks back to your coverage and how confident you are and how careful you are and how much people can trust you. You have to be careful on social media. It's really easy to make mistakes. And I think, a few too many mistakes and you're in trouble, not just with your employer, but maybe potential future employers. That stuff lives on forever.
Do you have any recommendations for students who may not be, have the backing of a news outlet or a job yet, but they want to increase their social media presence and they want to be active?
I would say be smart, be thoughtful, don't be snarky. I would, if you intend to have a very strong partisan voice on social media, you better think pretty hard about where you hope to be employed down the road. Because a partisan bent, even at this point in your journalism careers, could potentially disqualify you from employment. Like I said, it's happened to us before. We've had job candidates who we thought were otherwise perfect for a gig, but their social media was super partisan. And working for a nonprofit news organization, we cover a ton of Democrats and a ton of Republicans. I can't have somebody for whom a cursory look back through their Twitter feed is going to find stuff that outs them as being openly partisan.
You did mention, though, in your talk at South by Southwest that authenticity is key. Like, you want to have personality and a voice. Like, you don't just want to sound like a robot, right? Yep. So where is the balance between authenticity and the objectivity?
It depends on your comfort level. I think I've found that I really blend my personal and professional life on social media. I don't just tweet or post on Facebook professional stuff. I actually, weirdly, I just came back from maternity leave. I have an 11-week-old baby, and I posted on Facebook, like the 12 observations about being a brand new mom and like the transition back to work. And somebody saw it and was like, you should post this on Medium. It doesn't have a home on the Texas Tribune site. So I posted it on Medium. I'd never posted anything on Medium. And I tweeted about it, and it went viral. And suddenly I had, thousands of people from around the country writing me notes or sending me comments. And I thought that was a really interesting, and frankly, a lot of working moms reached out to me, people who had no association with the Texas Tribune, who said really great things about, this actually inspired me to learn more about the Texas Tribune. That was a very telling experience to me because people want to relate to you not just as, someone who knows a lot about policy, but someone who is human. And that may sound obvious to you guys, but it wasn't necessarily to me. And so I try to strike that balance between being, being an authority, being a source of news, but also being a human being. So.
Can you talk a little bit about Twitter and other social media as a news gathering tool?
It's absolutely a news gathering tool. I mean, it's a news breaking tool. It's a news gathering tool. I think, so just a couple examples, we frequently write stories based on what Texas lawmakers post on social media. They do ridiculous things. The state's agriculture commissioner, who's under fire right now for a whole litany of things, I think we wrote a series of stories last year after he posted on his personal Facebook page, pictures of nuclear bombs blowing up the Muslim world. I mean, it was like, really preposterous stuff that provided terrific fodder for reporters covering him. So it's certainly a news gathering tool. I think there is this sort of unfortunate competitive edge between reporters, particularly on Twitter, that Twitter is the place where we break the story. We show everybody else that we have the story first. The reality is, and we know this for a fact, Twitter is really journalists talking to journalists, policymakers talking to policymakers, the insiders talking to the insiders. Facebook is where the actual readers are. So sometimes I think we spend a little too much time, trying to stake our flag in the ground on Twitter when we should be spending a lot more resources reaching actual real people on Facebook.
Do you think that the responsibility lies with the news organization to go where your readers are, to find them on all platforms?
For us, absolutely. I mean, the Tribune's mission is to reach as many Texans as humanly possible, educate them and inform them about Texas. And so I think that may mean that, the bulk of our readers don't even come to our homepage, don't come to our website. I mean, everything is changing so fast. Facebook instant articles, Google AMP. We have a responsibility to make sure our medium, to make sure our stories are where people are. And for us in Texas, that means a lot of things. It means we offer all of our content free of charge to every news organization in the state. You fly to El Paso and you see Tribune stories in the El Paso Times. You see them on the front page of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. You go to Houston and you turn on the nightly news on KHOU and you're going to see a Texas Tribune, week in review. We have video content that we offer. So we are trying to get on as many platforms as humanly possible. Old school platforms, new school platforms, social media, everything in between. And that's our responsibility.
So I want to ask about that. When you offer everything, when you're putting your content out there for free, essentially you want it to have as broad a reach as possible, right?
Exactly.
What's the revenue model there? I mean, are you just trying to associate your name with quality? Or?
Yep, I don't think there is, at this point, there's not a revenue model with us saying, to every news organization in Texas, please run our content for free. But when we go to donors and to sponsors and to members and say, please support the Texas Tribune, we say, please support the Texas Tribune because you're not just supporting the Texas Tribune, you're supporting quality journalism in every news organization, in every newspaper, on every news website, and on every TV station in this state. And so that's, that's a major sales pitch when you're going to someone to say, support the value that we're providing. We're educating and informing not just the sort of inside baseball folks in Austin, but everyone around the state, and particularly in news organizations that have had to say, shutter their capital bureaus or have really had to tone down their political coverage or can't afford to have somebody embedded with Ted Cruz on the presidential trail. We're providing those resources, and it really facilitates our ability to go to funders and say, support what we do. So that's the revenue model for that approach.
How different is your strategy depending on social media platform? Is there a lot of time that goes into thinking about how to package something for Facebook versus another?
I would say we haven't done enough of this yet, but that you're going to be seeing a lot of it. We're going to be, hiring a full-time social media editor in the next couple of months, who's going to be thinking about that a lot. Our approach right now has basically been put everything up as fast as possible, get it to as many eyeballs as possible. Just in the last week or two, we started playing around with Facebook live video. So we have a podcast, the Tribcast, that's really popular, and we streamed it live on Facebook today. We in the midst of all of the sort of storm damage in Houston this week, we promoted our Hell and High Water Hurricane project and used Facebook live video to have our reporters talking about different types of storm surge and liability in Houston. And within a couple of minutes of having this up on Facebook, this live video, we had 800 additional people tuned in watching it, which was insane to me. I mean, it really dramatically widens the reach. So I do think we need to be thinking about how best to produce content for social. There are a lot of people who may never come to our site. The only place they touch the Texas Tribune is on Facebook or on Twitter or on Snapchat or on Instagram or wherever. And it's important that we get our brand and those stories out to them wherever they want to find it, not just by typing in texastribune.org.
So going back to that piece that Evan wrote really quickly, he called you their big get, when they were putting together their team at the beginning. And I wanted to ask you, going forward, what do you look for when you're thinking about recruiting? What are your kind of must-have skills?
I'm looking for incredible storytellers, and that could be on any platform, any format. I'm no longer just looking for the person who can write brilliant copy. I'm looking for the person, and it may be that somebody can write brilliant copy, but I'm also looking for the person who can, tell the story with a really phenomenal visualization, or someone who's an animator, or somebody who is, um, specializes in doc style video. But I'm not looking for people who are an expert in all of those things at once. I mean, I think that's really important. I think in journalism education, I've seen a lot of people trying to say, all right, I need to make sure that I can wade into all these areas, but I need to make sure that on my resume it says that, I am experienced in Photoshop, and I also, can cut video, and I can also code, and, X, Y, and Z, go down the list. If you're sending me a resume that has all of those different skill sets on it, and you're, a junior in college, I'm going to look at that resume and say, okay, this person knows how to do all of these things just a little bit. I mean, what I really want, frankly, are people with expertise. And maybe you are a just stunningly beautiful magazine style writer. I don't really care if you can code, because I have people on my staff who can code really, really well. Maybe you can code like a total rock star, and you aren't a traditional, print reporter. Maybe you don't even necessarily have a journalism background, but you have a computer science background and you really want to get into journalism. Show me what you can build. I mean, we have people on our staff who had no journalism background before we hired them. They were interns, and we ended up bringing them on, and they're some of our top news apps developers now. So for me, specializing is important. Having an expertise is important. And showing me how beautifully you can tell stories on whatever format you've chosen is your, perfect format. That's what I want to see.
You guys credit developers also in your stories.
Oh yeah. I mean, our developers are reporters. We have, our news apps developers are reporters, just like any other reporter in our news organization. We don't differentiate between them. A storyteller is a storyteller, as far as I'm concerned.
Why do you think other outlets do differentiate?
I do think there's sort of an old school. I think some news organizations still think of their developers as IT. We don't think of our developers as IT. I think there is, particularly for newspapers, they're used to having graphics departments. Like when I worked at a newspaper, if you wanted a graphic to run with your story, you would type up your numbers and you'd dash down the hall and you'd put a piece of paper in, a box that basically said, this is the graphic I need. And I think a lot of news organizations sort of still think that way. Those folks will get credit somewhere buried within your story. Again, we just think there's so many different ways to tell stories that I don't necessarily need a print story that also has an interactive in it, that also has a video embedded in it, that also has a photo slideshow. Tell me the story one way, in the way that is the best possible format for that particular story, and I'm going to be happy.
What's the process for deciding what kinds of visualizations a story needs?
I think it depends on the story, and I think it depends on who it starts with, to be blunt. If a story starts with our higher ed reporter, and he says, you know what, I really, really want to dig into the business of college sports in Texas. I want to really take a look at how much universities are spending and making on their different sports. Our news apps developer might pipe up and at a Monday morning meeting and say, you know what, that sounds like an awesome story. Don't you think it would be awesome if we presented it fully in an interactive form? And our higher ed reporter may say, you know what, that's a great idea. How about you take the lead, and I'm going to advise you on it, and I'll help pull all the data together. That's how a lot of collaborations, a lot of discussions happen at the Tribune. We wanted to tell a story about the space race in Texas, the sort of burgeoning private space race in Texas. And as we started talking about the story, we had a couple of print reporters who were, working on it. And then we had a radio reporter on our staff who said, boy, I would love to go out. Can I go along and get a bunch of sound? And then the photographer who went out with them was like, oh my God, it was so beautiful out there. I took all this time-lapse photography. And then when they all came back and sat together in the room, they thought, like, why don't we, it was so incredible to be out there. Why don't we tell this story in an immersive multimedia experience versus just a text story with a radio element? And that's what it did. And it became this project called Starstruck that is just really unbelievably gorgeous. And so it's these sort of collaborative discussions, collaborations that happen in the newsroom with, a group of reporters sitting around a table. And that's sort of the fail fast mentality. We tried it one way, Starstruck one way, and it really wasn't perfect. And we all kind of thought, this doesn't feel right. So we derailed the whole thing and tried it a totally different way. It takes time. But at the end of the day, you have a project that you're incredibly proud of and that other people look to as being, really, really innovative. So,
Is there ever reluctance to let go of a strategy, or are you guys just like
oh, sure.
move on?
Oh, there's reluctance all the time. I mean, I think journalists, their like number one negative trait is how defensive they are. You come up with an idea and you think it's the best way, and then you put a lot of time and energy into one particular direction, and then it's not what you thought. And it's really hard to say, you know what? Let's just can all these beautiful words you wrote and do a slideshow instead. But sometimes you have to do that for the good of the story. So it's hard. It's, you're ripping off a Band-Aid in a big way when you do that.
So my last note on your recruiting hopes, like, so you want storytellers. If you had kind of it'd be great if they had ... Are there any skills that you are sort of looking for but are not must-haves?
It would be great if they had the vocabulary to collaborate with other departments. So if you are a badass writer, I want you to come in also having experience, working with coders so that you can go to them and say, this is my idea, can you help me execute it? Part of a big problem we have, even, with the sort of youthful news organization, is we often don't speak the same language. So the coders, speak one language, and the writers speak another language, and our multimedia producers speak a third language. And sometimes, there isn't sort of a project manager or project management. There's no project management experience, and so I think I want people who have worked in collaborative settings, whether it's on campus and they've produced a project with a whole bunch of other people. I'm looking for that sort of collaborative experience. Now, I'm also looking for great internships. So that's really when people are applying for jobs with us, young journalists are applying for jobs with us. I would be lying if I said I didn't look to see that you had experience elsewhere and you could show me the work that you'd produced there. It doesn't have to be a top tier newspaper. It has to be, you worked your butt off trying to produce a particular project at a news organization or for your student paper, and that the fruits of your labor really paid off.
Awesome. I think we're going to move to questions now.
I'll ask the first one. What can local newsrooms, TV, newspapers learn from the Tribune's business model and the nonprofit business model in general?
I think this is tough, and I think that's what we get asked a lot, is does the Texas Tribune model scale? The first place I would say that it absolutely scales is the events business. And you started to see that. The Houston Chronicle has a brand new building with, I think, an event space with 500 seats. The Dallas Morning News has really gotten into the business of these sort of day-long symposiums in Dallas on particular topics. The corporate underwriting for events absolutely scales, and I think every news organization should be in that business. But I also think something the Tribune has done really well in a short time is building up a brand and promoting our reporters as individual brands. We have a really loyal following, and I think a lot of sort of regional newspapers have struggled to maintain that loyalty. So I think pride in the brand is really an important asset for any newspaper or TV station.
Can I just ask one quick
Sure.
follow-up question on that? Do you think that the strength in your brand has been the fact that you have kept it very narrow in its focus?
Yes, I do think that for these nonprofit startups, niche is going to be the key word. I think we've tried really hard not to be too many things to too many people because we think it waters down the brand. And we've had to make some tough decisions on what we cover and what we don't cover based on that. But for us, we know our bread and butter is politics and policy, and we've kept a pretty narrow focus.
All right. Well, once again, thank you for coming out to speak with us today.
Absolutely.
I got a two-part question. First one is you mentioned earlier about how many people you looked at before their social media profiles, they seemed like great candidates, and then something in there gave it way too partisan. That either way, just too much of a bias. How much do you see now that online media profiles, it's becoming less social media and more professional media, where it's not so much about giving your own opinion as just presenting yourself as a professional worker? So how much is that where it's not about yourself and it's really just about who you want to present yourself at? And then the follow-up, which kind of ties into that, is with the Texas Tribune. I know you've written some articles, or your magazine's written some articles on Robert Morrow, the recent chair for Travis County GOP. and how much is that you can compare him easily to certain presidential candidates where more of your titles about it can be clickbait, can kind of just be, oh, this is an easy one to get click, unless if it's becoming more, it's not so much actual reporting where it's just an easy thing to get people to listen to it because of the ludicrous statements.
All right, so the first part about that was, like young journalists having sort of professional sites, like professional websites, right, for themselves or professional accounts. Is that? Yeah. Right. I mean, I tend to like those, to be honest, because there's generally they tend to be like an amalgam of the work that they've done. I don't feel the same sort of level of risk. You do see a lot of young, aspiring reporters who really are just sort of reporting the news by way of their social media accounts, and to me, that's a really safe place to start. Again, you might add a little bit of analysis in there, or sort of, cogent, thoughtful, nonpartisan, observations. Observations are not bad. Using slurs to describe presidential candidates, or bashing particular companies for their views, that kind of stuff can get you into hot water. But I think just covering the news or being thoughtful about the news is absolutely great. As far as clickbait is concerned, there are newspapers in this state that have websites that run pregnant mom bikini contests on their homepage. The Texas Tribune is never going to do that. For the most part, we feed people their vegetables. But every now and then, there's a little candy that gets thrown in there, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem. There is outlandish sort of news of the weird in Texas, and for a long time, we didn't really touch it. And then we'd see Slate getting insane traffic off of a Texas story, or the New York Times writing a Texas story. We didn't. How many of you are familiar with this Whole Foods story this week about the cake? All right, that's not a Texas Tribune story. I mean, I wish it was because the traffic is ridiculous. But that's not a story that we'd touch. But when a statewide elected official says something absolutely preposterous, or someone who's been elected to a position of authority is, spewing hate speech, it may seem like clickbait, but we're going to touch that stuff because we think our readers care about it and want to know. And so it is a fine line. We have to walk that balance. And I think too much of it is dangerous. You don't want people to think that you're dumbing down your content. But when it touches elected officials, even if it's pretty outlandish, I think we have a responsibility to make sure people know about it. And it's a perk for us because suddenly you'll have, 50,000 clicks on a story within a matter of hours.
Hi, I really like your wisdom that you're giving to us.
God, I'm not sure it's wisdom, but yeah.
Okay, so when you talk about politics, because generally when I get on Facebook, I really try hard not to be partisan, but like say if I was on a blog about politics per se, how do I maintain my voice but not yet be like too one-sided, if that makes sense?
Right. Again, I think observations are great. Being thoughtful, making interesting comparisons. Well, Ted Cruz said X this week, but he said something totally different last week. You can be thoughtful and analytical, without putting yourself in a position of a news organization down the road saying, this makes us uncomfortable. And there's sometimes when you have to draw a line, and I've said this before, I said this on the social media panel, the day that the Supreme Court ruling came down on same-sex marriage, I think some folks raised their eyebrows because I put on Twitter or on Facebook or somewhere that, I was pregnant at the time. I said I was really glad that my child was going to grow up and be able to marry whoever they wanted to marry. For me, it was like, this was a civil rights issue. This wasn't a partisan issue. This was something that I just felt at this point in my career, I didn't want to hide behind. And that's risky, I think, if you are a nonprofit news organization. Probably it wasn't the, if I'd been 22 and just starting my journalism career, I might not have done it. But I felt at this point in my career, I was okay taking a stand on it. And you have to decide where your own comfort level lies. And I think there are things like that where you're going to be safe. And there are things like, shitting all over the Republican Party repeatedly on social media, where it's going to be hard for somebody to say, yikes, I can cover this. I can hire this person to cover the Texas legislature. So that may not help you at all. I just say, keep it in mind. You know, that's what I tell people is just think before you hit send on that tweet.
Hi. So you spoke earlier about kind of you're looking for specialists in a particular area. If you have experience and you do have an established portfolio that is multimedia, that is, graphic design and web, and at what point do you decide to include that in your resume, or, should you only keep it specific to the job that you're applying for?
Oh, I would definitely include it. I mean, I did not mean to say that having skills, that I don't care if you have skills. I mean, hell, if you're an expert in a whole bunch of different areas, show me your skills, show me the work that you've done. At the end of the day, I care about the product, what you're showing me that you've produced, far more than I care about that list at the bottom of your resume of, proficient in X, Y, and Z. Show me the work.
Thank you so much for coming. So as a leader of a news organization, what leadership qualities do you think are the most important?
That's interesting. Project management. I said this earlier, and I know it sounds silly, but being able to pull together a group of people and have them happy and working together at the table, collaborating, coming up with ideas together, keeping people on deadline, advancing the ball. I mean, I think in leaders, I'm looking for, there are a couple types of leaders. There are visionaries. There are the leaders who are just like the big ideas people, and there are the leaders who just get shit done. I tend to be partial toward the get shit done folks because I'm one of those people. I think our CEO, Evan, is really a visionary. You need to have both types of leaders at an organization in order to, keep the trains running on time. So, and women, I want strong women at the top of news organizations. I think you see too much, even in these new digital first news organizations, you get around the table with the executives at these organizations, and it is still largely white men. And I thought we were all moving into this new digital space so we could shake things up.
Hi, right here. I just was wondering specifically with your work at the Tribune, if you had one or two moments or stories that really stood out of either a project that you were involved in or an interview that you did that was just prolific and a little bit.
Sure. So the first one is one some of you may have heard, and it's a story we decided not to write. And it was really early in the Trib's existence when we had just announced we were this politics and policy specific, state politics and policy news organization. The first big shooting at Fort Hood happened, and we were just brand new. We'd only been up for a couple of weeks, and the instinct of all the reporters, in that room was like, who's going to get in their car first and rush up the highway? And then we stopped and we were like, wait, all right, everybody, is the Fort Hood shooting our story? Okay, it's a federal military base. It's certainly a crime story. At the end of the day, we were like, we don't think that's a Tribune story. And it was terrifying because all the other media around us were mobilizing and rushing up 35. And we were basically like sitting on our hands trying to figure out if there was even anything in it for us. It turned out to really be a crucial moment for the Tribune because you have to decide what you're not going to do in addition to what you want to be. And so for us, that story became sort of the standard when news would break. Basically every day since then, when something happens, we sort of figure out the Fort Hood calculation. We did it with the UT student who was found murdered. We had to decide, and we actually have waded into that story a little bit, particularly around the foster care system. But we had to decide, is that story, our readers, oh my God, so many of them are centralized in Austin. There are so many UT alums who are Tribune readers. People were looking to us being like, where's the story about this murdered girl? And we decided our stories were going to be more around sort of campus safety more broadly, and around the sort of UT alumni family response than a sort of traditional crime story. So that's one example. The other one is, a lot of people ask us whether we have conflicts at the Tribune and how the sort of sponsorship model plays in. How can you all possibly be covering hard-hitting stories if you're accepting money from folks? When I started at the Tribune, I was an investigative reporter, and I was writing a story about the hospital, this hospital system, Christus Hospital, Christus Santa Rosa. I was writing a story, a tort reform story about a woman who'd had both of her legs mistakenly amputated below the knee. She went in for like a routine heart procedure, and they mixed her up with another patient, and they amputated both of her legs. And I was basically investigating this hospital system and this incident. And in the middle of all of it, you know, an editor came to me and said, you know, this hospital system is a major sponsor of the Texas Tribune. And I was like, well, not my problem. I mean, this woman got her legs amputated below the knee. And the hospital system, you know, initially, you know, freaked out and called our CEO, and, you know, Evan, to his credit, of course, said, I'm sorry, but the journalism is totally separate from, you know, from the funding. And we wrote the story, and we were like, well, that's the end of that relationship with that sponsor. And the next year, they re-upped with the Tribune again for their sponsorship. And so it was really a learning moment for me, mostly that the Tribune would never be bullied into, you know, not telling important stories. And also that at the end of the day, they felt being associated with the Tribune brand was so valuable for them that they would re-up even after we wrote a story about them basically ruining a woman's life. I mean, she actually died a couple of years later from complications. So there are two examples.
I'll ask one question while we're waiting, and then I'll pass over the mic. What's that?
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
Does the Tribune have any presidential election coverage plans, especially if Ted Cruz isn't involved? And how long of a vacation is Patrick going to get after Ted Cruz is eliminated?
He never wants a vacation. We are in this as long as Ted Cruz is in it. You know, the Tribune has been so blessed by having all of these Texas presidential candidates. I mean, we would not be on the presidential stage were it not for, you know, Rick Perry and then Ted Cruz. I don't think any of us thought Ted Cruz was going to be in it for as long as he has been. So we have made our convention coverage plans and already booked our tickets. So we're in it till the bitter end at this point. It sounds like brokered convention or none.
Okay, and then sorry for the questions,
No
but I was going to ask you, what is your best advice that you can give to own your skills as a storyteller or blogger or etc.?
Interesting. I mean, my best advice would be to hone your judgment. You know, we really often see either job candidates or fellow candidates who, you know, they can write beautifully or they can do X, Y, and Z skill, but their judgment is just not that sound. Their news judgment is not that sound. Or we see them, again, not to come back to the social media, but we see that they've said things on social media that we're just like, why would you do that? I think, you know, being thoughtful and professional, being really ambitious and willing to learn any skill. You know, we also, I would say just being a serious go-getter is important. I mean, when I started my career at the Dallas Morning News, I was so happy to have a full-time journalism job out of college that I would do anything. I mean, I covered cat shows. I'm deathly allergic to cats. I mean, I covered night cops. You know, I worked a 3 to midnight shift for 2 years that was, you know, pretty brutal, to be honest. And literally, I saw some terrible, terrible things. I worked weekends. You know, I desperately wanted to get on the front page as much as I could. So I would offer to help, you know, other reporters who are working on projects because I knew maybe I'd be able to get a byline. You know, no job should be too big or too small. And you know, we have sometimes fellows who will come in to work with us, and, you know, I'm trying to say this diplomatically. It's like, oh, well, I'm not here to help other reporters with their stories. I'm here to get my own bylines. Or, you know, oh, that press conference is kind of early, you know. And I want to shake them and say, there are not that many jobs in this field right now. You know, how badly do you want this? And so I do think being really willing to sort of go to the mat for a gig is crucial to showing the people you work with how much you care, how passionate you are, and how badly you want to be there. Those cat show stories don't last very long if you're good. So.
Thank you so much for being here with all this great insight for our students. I want to explore collaboration a little bit more because collaborating inside companies and organizations can be hard, but you mentioned the ProPublica Marshall Project that won the Pulitzer, and you all have collaborated, as you said, with ProPublica. What are the challenges to making those kinds of collaborations be successful? They look easy on the outside, and I know they are not.
So hard. This is really difficult because, you know, everybody says sort of collaboration is the way of the future in journalism, combining your resources. It can be really hard when you're bringing, say, a traditional, you know, established news organization together with a startup news organization, and you're trying to sort of sort out who's going to do what in a partnership. My best recommendation is the best partnerships are the ones like the one we just did with ProPublica, where ProPublica really handled the data analysis and the visualization side, and we really handled the on-the-ground reporting. I would say having a clear differentiation between what each partner is bringing to the table is really crucial. When you have two reporters from one news organization who want to do the on-the-ground reporting, and two reporters from the other news organization who also want to do the on-the-ground reporting, things get tricky. Figuring out which organization's editor is going to be the primary editor, which organization's copy editor is going to be the primary copy editor. We had just really a phenomenal project we did with the Austin American Statesman this year called Paid to Prosecute. That was just a really important look at Texas Mutual Insurance Company and some of the ways it was playing inside the district attorney's office in Austin. And when we started going through the copy editing phase, one copy editor at our organization would find some mistakes, and then a copy editor at the Statesman would find some mistakes. And it was a total mess trying to get these fixes back and forth between the two organizations. We also, both news organizations posted this project on their website because everybody wants to get the web traffic from it. We wanted to get the web traffic from it. The Statesman also wanted to get the web traffic from it. Makes perfect sense. We ended up building two almost identical websites from scratch, coders from both organizations producing these, making sure that the project was up on their website in the best way possible. This is not to take away from this project. It was phenomenal journalism, and the reporters were stellar and worked awesome together. But the areas where we, potentially could have saved resources, we probably weren't as smart about it because, there was a little bit of territorialness. Is that a word? Probably not. Being territorial and making sure that, everybody had it up on their own website. We probably could have slashed the developer resources in half and the copy editing resources in half if we'd run it all out of one shop. So those are big challenges. With ProPublica and this big Hell and High Water project, we took their code and we also put it up on our website. So we have a version of the interactive on our website that looks exactly like ProPublica's. The challenge with this is that in Google search, the code looks the same, and so Google only chooses one. And so if you look for Hell and High Water on Google, you don't even see our page. You see ProPublica's page. So there are challenges in both the coding problems on both ends. So it's not easy. But I think worth it. Yep.
As Emily mentioned, she has an 11-week-old, and we have promised her that we would let her out at 6 o'clock to attend to other duties that she needs to handle. So let's please thank Emily for coming down. One real quick note for my